Welcome to episode 12 of the Critical Coach podcast. If you want to support me, you can do so by getting some gear from thecriticalcoach.com or simply share some of my content on your social media platform of choice. If you enjoy the podcast, follow it on Spotify, subscribe on YouTube, or give it 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. In this episode, I'm talking to Chelsey Kosalka, my last client before stepping away from coaching. Now, a lot of my content is about nerding out on the technical aspects of coaching, but at its core, coaching is a practical vocation. Theoretical knowledge is used to solve real problems for real people, and one of the more difficult problems to solve is that of long-term injury. I invited Chelsey on to talk about her experience of long-term injury, rehabilitation, and eventual recovery. The goal of our conversation was to ground that process within a personal story, to provide some insight for those unfamiliar with the experience, and to highlight signs of good and bad coaches for those seeking help. We discuss how she was injured, her search for relief, the different coaches she worked with, and how their different approaches helped or hindered her recovery. Cheers. Let's start with how you and I know each other. You were my last client before I stepped away from the gym, or stepped away from coaching at least. And I was hopefully the first coach where things started to get better for you. Not the last one, but the first of, like a series of other coaches who were able to help you. And then there's the other side of it, which is that you and I share an experience of long-term injury and chronic pain. Now we'll come back to that, but I want to go back to your initial injury. Like, when did that process of what ended up becoming chronic injury, chronic pain start for you?
Yeah, so I was just driving in on to TAFE and had a rear end accident, and then I thought I was okay after that, and then 2 weeks later the same thing happened in the same spot. The second time I ended up in hospital with that one.
So did you rear end someone else, or did someone else rear end you?
No, both times it rear ended me. So I had quite a nasty whiplash that I sort of ignored the first time, and then it sort of backed it up and ricocheted down my back the second time.
Okay. Yeah. So what about it? Was it just, what was it that put you in hospital from the second one?
I can't quite remember, but yeah, the pain was just, another level that I'd never experienced before, especially in the lower back region.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like it was a pretty bad accident.
Yeah, the second time wrote my car off.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so just at the CRT in Reed there where the problematic roundabout is. And so it was definitely a pain I'd never felt before. I was training in a commercial gym all of that time prior to. My back had never been a strong point anyway, but yeah, this really caused me some issues, and that's kind of what led me to look for some rehab.
When you say your back wasn't a strong point before, do you just mean from like a fitness standpoint, or was there like some sort of injury or pain there beforehand?
I didn't have any particular injury that I knew of, although stemming back to primary school, I had fallen on my coccyx.
Oh, okay.
And I wasn't aware until just recently, actually, working with a chiro, that had impacted my alignment, because it was quite a bad fall on my coccyx there.
Yeah, it's one of those things that, like, I've had friends who have fallen on their coccyx. I've been kicked in the ass really hard by someone wearing boots, and I wore that pain for like 2 months, but it went away. Other people, like when I was at high school, a guy was like rehearsing for a play or something and fell on his ass, and that, like, he was out instantly. It was excruciating pain. They had to get an ambulance and everything.
Yeah, it doesn't tickle, that's for sure.
No, it was pretty brutal.
Yes. So, that's kind of what was going on prior to the accidents, and then I guess, accumulation of inflammation, the tight muscles are in and around the area, and some disc issues. I'm not sure of the specifics, but they did say that there was a disc out of alignment.
Was this
during
like
the
stuff
car.
on MRI or?
Yeah.
Okay.
So they popped me straight through to a MRI after that second car accident and checked it all out. But yeah, I didn't get any guidance from there. I was kind of just given some pain relief and sent on my way. Said to sort of take it easy, and that was really it.
Was there any plan for a follow-up or
No.
to like offload you to a physio or?
It was suggested that I would see a physio, but for me, I just had no luck with them in previous times.
Yeah.
It's kind of all wishy-washy. Until recently, I guess, my connections through, well, not so much physio, but more the soft tissue side of things, and then flow on into the chiro world.
Mm-hmm.
From there is where I've recently learned and become aware of like what does work for me.
Yeah, it's certainly, similar to coaching in the sense that, there's no shortage of people who can provide that service, but it's can certainly be frustrating just how difficult and, time consuming it can be to find someone who is not only, able to make a decent diagnosis, but actually able to help over the long term and not just, reduce symptoms when you see them and then you have to come back and have them reduced again, but it doesn't fix the underlying problem.
Yeah, and also help you understand what is going on in your body to prevent, whatever you can in order to help fix that or alleviate any pain or further injury.
Yeah, like the stuff that you can do outside of the clinic to sort of help yourself along.
Yeah.
Okay, so how long ago was that?
Oh, gosh, we're going back a fair bit now.
Because I think it was 2016 when we started working together.
Yeah.
So how far before that was this second accident?
It would have been about 12 months prior to that, because I'd tried to work with a few other coaches following that accident, and I just ended up not in a very good way, not in a desirable way, I guess you could say.
So that 12-month period, you've got go into hospital, you get you get discharged with some medication for pain management and not a lot else, it sounds like. Yeah,
just kind of the generic, maybe you might want to see a physiotherapist, and that was pretty much it. Yeah.
So what happened after you left?
After a few weeks, I sort of tried to mobilize myself and get back to my gym. At that time, I was training at Fernwood, training and working at Fernwood. And from there, I just found, the generic classes and movements that you're kind of led to do in those environments weren't agreeing with me. Mm-hmm. The back just would play up every time and kind of be like a progress, regress, progress, regress, regress. Mm-hmm. Like you just kind of felt like you were, I don't know, forever battling yourself with no win or movement of, moving forward. So then, I took it upon myself to kind of seek out some, I guess, knowledge and experience in the rehab world. Another coach that I had sourced at the time had a really good, I guess, following and numbers in his gym. But after training with him, I sort of was like, no, there was a couple of red flags there.
What were the red flags?
So when I started up with him, there was no real individual assessment of what was going on with me, how my body was moving, the mechanical side of things, how I squatted, where my starting point with him was.
Mm-hmm.
He kind of just threw me into jump on this cardio equipment, then we'll do like max reps, max volume, see how you fare. And I did that a couple of times, and the last time that I did it with him, I could not even put my shoes on.
Oh, wow.
My lower back was just so jarred up.
So was he essentially using a training session to maybe like that was as close as that was his assessment, I guess? It sounded like a sort of, he flogged you a bit though.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
Like, it was just, he just threw me in with no assessment. Like, I mean, in comparison, and I wasn't to know until I'd experienced it, but when I came to Real Fit, you guys stripped me right back to the basics, and it was, how I moved, where I was up to, what hurt, what engaged, what didn't engage, and helping me understand that process also in tying in with my injury.
Yeah, there was an assessment.
That's
and
right.
all of the how far back to strip you, as far as like exercise regression and regressing workload, all of that was a product of the assessment process. We use that to inform our decisions, and there is some physical exertion, at least in the physical screening, but it's not. It doesn't sound like it's anything like what you're talking about. It like it wasn't a training session. It was just like, can you get to this position?
Yeah, and it was just that little bit more time taken to even just be, perceptive of if I was in pain and allow me to exclaim that, I guess.
Yeah.
Whereas with the previous coach, at the time, I guess I didn't have the confidence because I didn't understand strength training fully, and especially, tying in with that injury again. I didn't have the confidence to speak up and say, look, that really hurts. So I guess I was I didn't want to be a whinging client.
It's there's a demarcation problem with that stuff, because especially if you're not used to doing, physical activity that sort of, can hurt a bit. It can be hard to tell the difference between what hurts because it's difficult and it's hard work, and what's pain that's coming from, an injury or something like that. And if you don't have, if you don't cross a certain threshold of exposure, it's hard to know where you should draw the line, and you sort of, depend on a coach to recognize that line for you before you get there, hopefully, and pull you back. But it sounds like that didn't happen.
No, none of it was aligning. And when I did say that, hey, I can't even get my shoes on today.
Yeah.
He was like, oh, that's normal. And I thought to myself at that stage, well, no, it's not.
So why couldn't you get your shoes on? Was it pain?
My back was just seized, and the muscles around it were spasming, and
oh wow,
yeah, like I was literally in tears trying to get shoes on, and I just thought that's not right.
That's not.
And it takes a bit for me.
That's not like post-training fatigue or soreness or anything like that. That's like a very different response.
Yes, yeah. It takes. I'm well aware of my own pain threshold, and it was just certainly not what I'd experienced before. So, at that point, I decided that I would try one more avenue, and that's where I landed with you.
Okay. So I went back through we talked about this before. I went back through my emails and stuff to try and find all of like the notes that I take during the interview and screening. And it looks like I've basically purged all of that, which, makes sense. It's personal information. I wasn't coaching anymore. I was able to find like snippets of email trails. And it looks like, so you came to the gym through the website, and I think you were talking to Matt, one of the previous owners, of Real Fit and sort of gave him a little bit of background on you, and then he I'm not sure whether he set you up with me or whether I was just the coach who was on floor shift and was going to go through that sort of screening process with you.
It's a while back.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have remembered any of it if it wasn't for the emails being there. I think that's how it came about. It's probably not particularly important. So let's talk about sort of what happened when you came into the gym, and like we were saying before, it was like 2016, so memory might be a little hazy or inaccurate. So if I'm misremembering something, tell me.
Yeah, sure.
So the process that we were going through then, and I think it's become standardized in the gym now, is when a new person comes in to train at the gym, there's an interview and there's a physical screening afterwards, and then basically use that to inform basically the path we're going to go down, what the training program's going to be, how far back do we regress you. You were in an interesting position. I think you still had a membership to run out at a Globo gym, like Club Lime or something like that. So we were doing PT like once a week or once a fortnight or something like that. And then you had a training program to do at that gym.
Yes.
And I found the training program. It's ridiculously basic. And the funny thing was, when I looked at my handover notes from when I was leaving the gym, I think I said something like, I thought we should give Chelsey, something that she can enjoy, something she can feel good about now before we have to give her the really boring stuff. And I was looking at the training program going, fucking hell, if that was the fun stuff, I don't know what the hell the boring stuff was going to be when you came to start training at Real Fit. All right, so let's talk about the interview. Most of that, from what I remember, was you telling me your story, which was, what brought you to this point, why are you here, what do you expect to get out of this? And there's a whole bunch of useful information that comes in that process where you just essentially shut up and let someone else tell you what's going on.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that was not present in what you'd been exposed to before with other coaches.
Definitely not. I suppose with other coaches that sort of comes out in time, but it's definitely not as personable straight up. And I guess for me, that was attractive in terms of we were able to see if we gelled early on in the piece.
Yeah.
At that stage, I was just fed up with the bullshit and I wanted it straight up.
Were you expecting that to be the case when you came to Real Fit as well?
I didn't know what to expect, if I was honest. When I came to Real Fit, my confidence was probably at an all-time low, not only due to those injuries, but, just, mental health and some other things going on. So it was almost the last straw for me. Yeah, and I guess that dealing with real people that weren't there to waste your time or sell you some sort of bullshit product was...
Yeah, you're not just another commodity walking in
that's
to
right.
a business.
Yeah, so that's probably what really initially caught my interest or piqued my interest.
But that was after you'd made the decision to come in.
Yeah. Prior to that, I grew up with Joe Matthews' wife, Kizzy.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, whilst we're not close mates, we've kind of always kept in touch in respect of, over social media and stuff like that. And in years prior to that, she'd asked me to come and train at the gym. And yeah, I mean, that meant a lot to me. But at the same time, I was kind of like, well, I'm not strong enough. I'm not cool enough. I'm not fit enough. I'm not pretty enough. I'm not anything enough to walk in those doors.
Yeah.
When none of that bullshit really mattered. So it took me a while to process also that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think knowing the expertise was there and the knowledge base was there, I kind of just went, lean the fuck in and get your body in there and see what it's all about.
Yeah, worst thing that happens is you're back where you started.
Yeah.
Well, worst thing that happens is that we hurt you and make you worse, but hopefully that doesn't happen.
That's right. Yeah.
The perception you had of, what kind of person trained at Real Fit is quite interesting. Was there anything that, was that like something that you convinced yourself of, or was there something, about the way the gym presented itself that sort of led you to believe that was the case?
There was certainly nothing about the gym that, in how they presented themselves that made me think that. When you strip it back, it's really just a whole heap of decent people committing to their results, making a consistent effort. And that's what you see on the outside. You don't see what people battle. You don't see where they start. And I guess from coming from a commercial environment,
which is quite sort of impersonal.
Yeah.
And that can be, a plus for some people. If you just want to be left alone and train.
Absolutely.
It's a great place to be.
Yes. And that's a lot of what attracted me to the commercial environment in the first place, because I had a lot of weight to lose and I didn't really want to interact with people whilst doing that. And, that's what I achieved. But this was now something that I needed to jump into and put prevention in the mix and, rehabilitation in the mix. And I just wanted solid guidance around that, which is why I did reach out.
What sort of expectations did you have coming in?
The expectations, at that stage, like I mentioned before, I just didn't want any bullshit in the mix. I didn't care if I needed to have a mundane program or strip back to basics. If anything, that was kind of like a little bit of a relief to hear. And at that point, it kind of ticked those boxes in terms of I didn't feel uncomfortable. I was kind of like, okay, this is a realistic viewpoint, and if I've got to do that, then I've got to do that. And if I've got to do it for a couple of years, then I've got to do it for a couple of years. Everybody starts somewhere, and that was my journey. So that's pretty much the only expectations I had. I think the rest were internal, like you kind of I expected myself to be a pretty nervous wreck. And
you certainly seemed, there was, I don't know if trepidation is a word, but, a fair, a noticeable sense of, I guess, justifiable anxiety about the process, especially if you've built it up in your mind a little bit before and you've been let down quite a lot in the past. It's very hard to sort of put yourself back in that mix again, and effectively be vulnerable in that way with it, which I think a lot of people might not expect. I mean, from my side of it, you keep going to people asking for help, and at some point, it's almost like you think that, haven't you learned your lesson yet? Like, stop asking. It's not going to get any better, and these people are just going to let you down and make you miserable. And then when you put yourself out there again and become vulnerable to being let down again, and if that happens again, it just, the time until you're willing to do that again just gets longer and longer. And it's almost like you sort of, it almost becomes your own fault. In the sense, like, what were you expecting? Sort of, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. But when it's like 5, 6, 7 times, and you're like, haven't you learned your lesson yet?
Yeah.
Stop.
Yeah, you certainly do you do start to sort of think and feel a little bit alienated in that world. I've always been a huge believer in learning from your failures, but when you're trying to work with somebody and be educated in that process, it's a different perspective. So you do sort of start to overthink a lot of it. And I guess, in the strength world, you do go into a bit of avoidance because I don't know so much these days, but back when I was seeking out that help, or maybe my perspectives changed. The stereotype strength and conditioning place was super fit, super confident, extroverts that, had all the gear and they had every idea.
It's normally people think stereotype, it's it's not an accurate representation. Like, no, that's how stereotypes come about in the first place. It doesn't mean that you treat people as the average value of whatever group they belong to, but you are going to come across those people.
Yeah.
And even if they're only 60% of the industry, you're going to come across them quite a bit. You're going to see a lot of them on social media. And especially extroversion. For most people, it's almost a prerequisite for the job. Real Fit's interesting because it's got at least two introverted coaches that I know of. I would have been the third when I was back there. But yeah, it's quite weird to find an introverted personal trainer, strength and conditioning coach, whatever.
That's kind of another thing that attracted me to stick with Real Fit is, working with you. You weren't there to yell at me and, make yourself a status within those walls. You were humble. You told me how
I was shy.
Yeah, there was a level of shyness, but it worked for us because,
Yeah.
there was a mutual understanding in that respect. You were super humble. I enjoyed how you challenged certain perspectives of mine.
Mm-hmm.
It sort of helped open up my mind and also, process the environment and the whole process that I had to go through led by you. And then when you handed over to Joe, it sort of prepped me pretty well, even though we were only working together for a short time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we did the interview, we did the screening process. The two bits I do remember were quite specific motor control deficits, which it was like a surprise that we sort of expected to find. But, it's interesting looking back at it now that now I know so much more about the spine than I did back then. And I sort of wonder if I should have been as confident as I was at the time. And that's knowing that I wasn't very confident at the time anyway, about my ability to help you. But I think that's the bit that sticks in my mind from when we sort of sat down and had a chat after we'd done the interview and the screening was I said, I think I can help you. And there was what I saw, there was was almost like a relief in your eyes. It was like, oh, it's not what you might think you want to hear. Like you want someone to go, yes, I know exactly what's wrong with you and I can help you. But it's generally those are people that you want to avoid. It was, I guess it's probably counterintuitive that being that honest about your limitations might actually inspire confidence on the other side. I think a lot of people probably wouldn't expect that.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, like I said before, I was just so fed up with I guess it was like a salesman approach in my previous experiences, that when you did say that, you think, and you were genuine, I could hear it in your voice and I could see it in your facial expression, that, this was a reality and you didn't sell it to me as something that was like an 8-week or a 12-week program. This was going to be like something that was I was in for the long haul. And
yeah, that was something that was, you know, when I dealt with people, especially rehab-based stuff, it was often the case that, you know, if people asked how long it was going to take, I don't know.
that's right.
It takes as long as it takes. The only thing I can tell you is that in most cases, the better it gets, the faster it gets better. But that initial phase where you start to effectively wind back the pain levels and, you know, get some sort of foothold in whatever training you need to do to sort of regain some capacity. It's, you know, who knows how long that's going to take.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was a huge learning process for me. And a lot of it was just getting comfortable with the mundane, repetitive program stuff that, you set me out to learn.
I'll pull up the program just so that we can...
It'd be interesting to see.
Yeah. So this was a program I think that you were doing at your gym 2, maybe 3 times a week. And then we would PT once, I think it was once a week. And it wasn't a different training program when we were PTing. It was just me assessing your capacity and potential to progress to something more complex. So the warm-up, pretty standard, nothing, exciting there. It's just a warm-up. But the main training is very, very simple. Like a whole training session is 3 sets of 10 to 12 reps of 2 exercises, and that's it. And that's bang kettlebell deadlift and a goblet squat on one day, bench press and overhead press on another day. That's it. And when I think of like my training program now, training programs I've written for other people, that's a really basic training program. Like you'd be in and out of the gym real quick.
Yeah.
But that might shock a lot of people to sort of get something that simple.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then there's, some rehab stuff around that and some office mobility stuff. But that's, yeah, it's hard to believe that there was more boring stuff to come after that.
Yeah, gosh, that's interesting looking back on that. I don't remember that now looking back on it, but yeah, I certainly remember prior to coming to you, I never had warm-up stuff. So you said,
Oh, really?
basic warm-up. I never really, my warm-up was, I'll go for a walk on the treadmill for 10 minutes.
Yeah, that's part of a warm-up.
So that's part of one, but I never had
Where's the
that,
rest?
that physical preparation.
Yeah.
Or activation stuff. So I've found that over the years, making good friends with that physical preparation and activation stuff has done me the world of good. And it's actually ceased any sort of pain that I once had just by doing that and, strengthening those areas.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly, it's something I had to, like, I wouldn't be able to be back training in the gym now if I didn't have a very, carefully planned warm-up.
Yeah.
Like the risk of hurting myself again at the gym would be much higher. And as I get older, that warm-up's going to become more important and it's probably going to become longer.
Yes.
As I get over as well. So, the training session might stay the same, but the amount of time it takes to get through it is probably going to get longer as I get older. So what was your... I'm not sure how long we were training together before I stepped away. It was probably a month, maybe 2 months.
I think it was about the 2-month mark, yeah.
Yeah. What was your experience of such a basic training program like?
Oh, don't get me wrong. There were peaks and troughs, definitely. There were days where I was like, well, just get it done. If this is what I've got to do, I've got to do it. And then there were days where I was just bored out of my brain. And they're the days that you question everything.
So how did you deal with the boredom? Especially because, I might, let's say, I gave off, some air of credibility during the interview and the screening, but you don't actually know whether that's bullshit or not until you've gone through that really, potentially slow and boring process, and you don't know when that's going to end either. So it's sort of like, it's a leap of faith and you don't know how long it's going to last.
Yeah, that's so true. How'd I get through it? Yeah, look, I think I was just happy to be learning the strength, the movement pattern. And I mean, music always helps. So that sort of drove me through. But the fact that I didn't have any significant pain after our sessions, I mean, I felt like I was working, definitely, and working areas that I probably had never felt before, which for me was a process that I really enjoyed, and I always do enjoy, and I always have, probably always will. Just learning those different parts of your body and the mechanics of it, etc. I kind of try and tap into that. And for me, like when I'm training, I sort of get into these little zones, and then before you know it, your program's done, or, you've spent an hour in the gym. And
yeah, I'm almost wondering whether maybe part of it was, I mean, I can't remember, what I would have said to you during those training sessions, but I know myself well enough that I probably introduced or made you aware of a level of, complexity with what seemed like a simple exercise by, these are the number of things that you want to focus on and get right. And maybe that turns what is, on the surface, a simple exercise into something that's quite complex if you want to do it, perfectly, or as perfectly as you can.
yeah, that's definitely something that I've always enjoyed about you, is that you are quite a technical person. And whilst that might be intimidating to some, or, people may lose interest quickly,
That's not for everyone.
I'm certainly not that kind of person. So, yeah, like for me, that was part of the education process, and engaging and learning what you were talking about and how it worked for me was definitely something that I tapped into as well.
Okay. So after, let's say, 2 months, I decide to step away from coaching.
Yes.
Now, if we put that in the context of what you'd gone through in the past with other coaches and I guess with medical personnel as well, and then you feel like you're finally making some headway, and then the person who's sort of responsible for guiding you down that process says, yeah, I'm not going to do it anymore. What's that like?
Yeah. Look, I had an inkling of certain particulars that may have been surrounding your personal circumstances. So for me, I was very understanding of that process. Don't get me wrong, like I was down and out about it because we had, formed a nice relationship in terms of you being my coach and me being your client. But at the same time, you've got to have that open mind and remember that coaches are human beings too. And whatever goes on in their lives, you've just got to kind of understand as much as they understand what's going on in yours.
So you didn't go back to that, this is another person who's let me down again, or you did?
Not so much with you.
Okay.
No, I trusted in the real fit environment. By that stage, I've kind of sort of tried to. I was still very, very anxious, very, very nervous every time I walked into the gym. But I'd formed some relationships by that stage, and I'd started to talk to some of the other coaches as well. And I think just before you left, you'd introduced me to Joe. I mean, I knew of Joe being Kizzy's husband and the owner, one of the co-owners. You know, he's just one of those bright souls that kind of walks around the gym and everybody knows Joe. So I felt comfortable in that respect, but at that stage I didn't know that you would be handing me over to him, or that he would agree to take me on.
Okay. It's not something I'd really considered, but, now that you've mentioned it, it's I wonder whether other people miss that as well, that, people, I guess employees will come and go over time, no matter how good a working environment is. And the relationship that you have with your clients as a business is not just the coaches that have a relationship with their clients, but the client's relationship to the business as itself. So, so I guess you weren't just wary of how I interacted with you, but that whole environment that surrounded it as well, and whether the environment's credible, not just, the one individual that you're working with.
I think in Real Fit, you don't really have like a choice but to sort of become part of the community, because
you can't really, there's nowhere to hide.
It's just so contagious in a positive way. So I guess there was a level of comfort in, and the trust that I'd gained in that short time with you did flow into a broader spectrum within the gym and the community. So I sort of had faith that I'd be looked after.
Okay. So what was your experience with Joe like? I'm pretty sure it was Joe that took over when I left.
Yeah, so I started training with Joe Matthews, and look, I feel like I'll forever be in debt to Joe. He helped me progress in ways that I never thought I probably ever could, both mentally and physically. So, we stuck with some of the basics for probably quite a while. I progressed and regressed. But it got to the point where I was stable enough to undertake the training program that he'd assigned me without pain, without niggle. And you have your good days and your bad days. And then there'd be times where, my training purpose and my training why sort of changed with Joe once I'd laid down those foundations and learnt the foundations that you sort of had passed on.
How did it change?
So I guess once I gained that little bit of confidence and the strength, of course, learning how my body worked and sort of understanding all of that, I was able to undertake movements that I never would have had the confidence to, or my body just couldn't do
without sort of risk of pain or
I was able to do all of that with no issues. So then my next sort of step was to be strong and stable enough to be able to care for my dad, and have the body strength to lift him in and out of bed. Or
because that's, not just requires a certain amount of strength to do that, but it's very, awkward positions to do it in, and the cost of making a mechanical mistake when you're doing that sort of stuff can be incredibly high. Especially if you've already got some sort of structural trauma, sitting there.
That's right, and it can be high to not only yourself but, the patient that you may be caring for. So that sort of was my drive to keep that consistency up, and that consistency ebbed and flowed depending on circumstances surrounding that situation. So therein lies those challenges of, I guess, and looking back on it, I felt bad at times putting Joe through that, asking to reschedule or, move things around. but at the end of the day, that becomes part of your life, and he was very accommodating of that too. So
yeah, Joe's been around long enough that he probably knows that's just part of the game.
absolutely. And I guess as a client, you sort of those are the things that you question. You sort of become a little bit paranoid of letting your coach down. You're investing in them, but they invest in you. And
Oh, absolutely. Like I've certainly with other people said, look, you know, I have a responsibility to you, not just, because you're paying me, but because you've put your trust in me. But at the same time, you have a responsibility to my reputation.
yes.
That, you know, coaching is one of those things that it's, unless for a very small number of people, but for the vast majority, it's never going to be a well-paid profession because it just doesn't scale. You can't, you just can't have high quality contact with large numbers of people. It's just not going to work.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know where I was going with that. I got like a brain fart halfway through it. We were talking about
Me investing
and Joe.
and
yeah.
coaches reinvesting.
Yes. Thank you.
You're right.
So you're still going through that process with Joe and sort of struggling with it.
Yeah, I guess there was a level of FOMO as well. Like you're in that gym, and after a length of time, you're seeing people do those major lifts that you sort of have always desired and admired.
Yeah, for people that don't know, there's some quite competent powerlifters
Very.
that train at real fit, and most of them are not, I guess, what you would expect of a powerlifter. There's some people who are probably older than you'd expect, and there's some girls who are probably much smaller than you'd expect who are just insanely strong.
Absolute weapons. Yeah. So the environment is that of which you're in admiration all the time, which is positive, but it can also turn around and eat you alive.
You mean like if you're comparing yourself to them?
Yes, which isn't healthy to do, but we all do it.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with, being aspirational, but yeah, I guess it's, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today, because there's always going to be someone you could look up to that's done better than you, but you got to start somewhere.
Oh, 100%. And I guess that's part of the process too. But yeah, so we probably stuck with some of the more basic programming for maybe another 12 to 18 months.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, we moved into learning the foundations of the major lifts, being bench, deads, and squats. So
how did you go? I mean, what was your confidence like as far as, worrying about whether you're going to hurt yourself again? Because at that point, you'd be 18 months to 2 years into the process with Real Fit, and especially if you've got issues with your back, deadlift and squat can be high risk.
yeah, there was always an anxiety there. And I guess it was learning that difference of the difference in pain of, muscle activation or, muscle, whatever you want to call it, versus inflammation and
like
those
injury pain,
injury
versus
niggles, etc.
hard work pain.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm trying to get at. So there's a level of anxiety there, and you're kind of always wondering when it's going to tip.
Mm-hmm.
Or there's a little bit of a sort of voice in your head saying, just be careful, just be careful. There's a hesitation, but there's also this curiosity feeding you.
Yeah, like, can I do this and not hurt myself now?
Yes.
Am I at that point?
Yes. Can I trust in myself? Can I trust in Joe?
Yeah. I mean, ideally, by that point, when you get to that stage and you're looking to do those exercises again, as far as, you know, the nervous system and motor learning goes, you want to be at the point where you don't have to think about the things that, protect you from that sort of injury anymore. You want to be you want to be free to focus on the exercise and how to do that. If you're at the point where you're still thinking, I need to contract this muscle in order to prevent an injury, you're probably not
Ready.
there yet.
Yeah.
But you don't know that you're there yet. Well, Joe probably would have known whether you were there yet or not. But yeah, from your side of it, it's probably a little bit more ambiguous.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. There were many times where Joe's like, you can do it. And I'm like, I can't. And yeah, I guess that's part of building that confidence and learning the difference.
Yeah. But I should point out that, if you look at it as for any coach and a client says, I can't do this, and a coach says, yes, you can, that can very easily be a negative thing if your confidence as a coach doesn't match your competency. A bad coach can say that and injure someone.
Yes.
It might just, sort of like cheerleading where they're like, come on, you could do it. And like, maybe you can, but you really shouldn't. And then on the other end of the scale, you have a good coach who sees not just the potential that you don't see in yourself, but the competency that you might not be aware that you have. And if they're a good coach, they see it even when you don't. And then it can be, perfectly fine. It can be a positive thing, but yeah, it can very easily go in the other direction which is essentially what you got exposed to before.
Yeah, you're so
Someone was
right.
like, yeah, you can totally do it.
Yeah.
And you're like, yeah, but I shouldn't.
That's right, yeah. I guess the difference between, then and where we came to be is when I was cued by Joe, though that really sat well with me. Particular cues made sense, and then my body would just click into gear, and I'd be like, "Oh, wow!"
Yeah, and if you're getting to the end, or finally outside a rehab process, that's exactly where you want to be.
Yeah,
the point you're like, "Oh, my body just does this on its own now." Like, that's exactly where you want to be.
Yes, yeah. But it's that education process too. The way that a coach articulates those particulars to you is so important, in my opinion. And being able to adjust that to the particular person that you're working with, just like you adjust their movements, is critical.
Different people will
Absolutely
want
critical.
different, I guess, depth of, not just rationale, but sort of like a justification that, this is how I know you're at this point.
Yeah.
And then you're sort of like, oh yeah, I can understand that. All right, I can get on board with that.
Yeah. I mean, it might not be everybody's cup of tea, but I don't think that I don't think you'll ever reach your full potential if you're not willing to listen to that process and educate yourself, like remove the ego. Don't worry about how much you're lifting, and just understand every fiber of those foundations.
It's certainly something I'm fond of, but I think it's like the idea of coaching redundancy. But I think it's probably just some of that is just my interest. But from a practical standpoint, there's only so much time you have contact with your coach.
It's very true.
And most of your life happens outside of the gym as a client, not inside the gym. So, a good coach empowers someone to start making their own decisions so that they can take, they can more reliably make good decisions when they're outside of the gym. And when they're in the gym, you can start teaching them, new skills so that they can take them with you. And if you're a good coach, you'll always be ahead of your client in that respect, and there'll always be something you can teach them. But yeah, long term, I think it's a process that people really need to get on board with, not just coaches, but clients as well. Like, if you want this to be good for you, you've got to be, like you said, willing to listen and, take some responsibility for how things go for you when you're at the gym, and maybe not doing a PT session and when you're outside the gym.
Yeah. A lot of the time that'll involve doing things that you absolutely really do not enjoy.
Yeah.
But you learn to turn that process around and enjoy it and, connect in. Just an example, I used to hate doing squats, hated them. They were like the bane of my existence. But now they're one of my favorite lifts. And yeah.
There is like something weird about squats in that sense. A lot of people, like, that's the one that they really don't like.
Yeah.
Even if they're really good at it, there's something about that exercise that just rubs people the wrong way. I have no idea what it is.
Yeah, that and
it feels like a lot of work.
Yes, it does. It takes it out of you. That and split squats, lunges, etc. That is like what brings the demon out in me.
Oh yeah, split squats. Yeah, like Bulgarian split squats.
Yeah.
Those are pretty brutal as well. Now I think of it.
But you learn to love them.
You might.
Maybe.
So you sort of started on that road to recovery with me. You got, sounds like, much further along with Joe and over a much longer period of time.
Yes.
And was Abir the next coach, or was there someone else in between? So actually, let's bookend the thing with Joe. How had things changed for you by the time you got to the end of your work with Joe?
Yeah, how do you put that into words? A huge shift in confidence. So for me, like I said, a lot of what my work with Joe was both mentally and physical. The confidence drives a lot of that physical, I guess you could say. So, I couldn't even really pick up a bar when I first started with you guys. And, with Joe, I think I've finished up, heading for the 100 mark on my deads. And
how long was this? Like, when you were at that point, how long had you been training at the gym for?
That was probably 4-year mark.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a long time to be sticking with it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, he drove home that consistency, showing up, and that's kind of just stuck with me. If you show up and you do your thing, even if it's not at full capacity or, depending on your energy levels, etc. Or for me, a lot of it was like where I was at mentally. You reap the reward, both, injury prevention. By that stage, I could train pain-free. I was doing classes. I was able to identify where I needed to adjust to avoid those niggles or bringing on any sort of injury niggles.
So you were, at this point, to some degree empowered to make your own decisions about what's good, what's bad.
Yeah.
Well, that's cool.
I was kind of asking, for that little bit more.
Well, I guess especially in classes where, I've got my own perspective on how classes should be run, but generally, the level of individual, care for the individual drops during a class.
Absolutely.
It's very difficult to get close to a PT level of quality in a class setting. Like, you can get close to it, but I think it's probably not going to be there for everyone. So I guess considering your background, if someone wants to get into classes, they need to have started to pick up some skills of their own so that they can see what's going on and go, I'm going to need to change this exercise for me, or, do something differently in order to participate.
Yeah, I'd highly recommend that. And it's probably a piece of advice that I try and communicate to people who do, those, let's just use F45 as an example. I've spoken to many people that they're just looking to better their fitness and health, and that's, I respect that definitely. But if you're coming out injured every class or every few classes, then it is, I highly recommend sort of checking in with a coach to just sort of see what works for you. And, when I started to do classes at Real Fit, Joe, we made it part of my program. So kettlebell swings, like they might seem like a pretty straightforward movement, but there's a lot of mechanics that goes into it and engagement of different muscles that a lot of people probably don't use.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what once would have really flared my back up, I learned to navigate through that guidance and movement pattern.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing that happens in classes that I think coaches are at least aware of, most of them, but the people participating in them might not be, which is just how powerful peer pressure is in that environment. And I think a lot of people don't realize that it's happening to them, where one of the things that makes that sort of has been really big for CrossFit and 45 and similar sort of class high intensity stuff is that they leverage the power of pride and shame to get people to work through peer pressure.
Yeah.
And it's, and there's nowhere to hide in those environments. And if you haven't gotten yourself to the point psychologically where you can set the ego aside in those environments, it's very easy to push someone too far quite quickly.
Yeah, you're so right. And, I wish more people tapped into that reality. I've certainly been there myself. That's, prior to coming to Real Fit and prior to the accidents, that's kind of what was driving my consistency in the gym, was that competition, not only with myself, but, people that I'd familiarized myself with in classes.
And it's satisfying to go through that
Yeah,
process,
absolutely it
to
is.
compare yourself to other people, to compete with your friends. And there's a lot of good stuff about it, but there can be a dark side to it.
Absolutely. And it can hinder your process as
Absolutely.
well. So
yeah, because it's you are writing a program to appeal to the average, and that's it doesn't work for the individual the same way. Like, you're trying to cover a whole bunch of bases, and that means it's going to be suboptimal for people individually, but as a group, it works a little bit better.
Yeah, there's no one size fits all in those respects. And that's something that I really dislike about the industry, is that, a lot of, sports or those functional fitness environments sell it as a one size fits all.
Yeah.
Come in, get it done,
And they talk about scaling for the individual, but I worked in that environment as a CrossFit coach for I can't remember exactly, but at least 2 or 3 years, and the set aside the willingness of coaches to scale, which I found generally they just couldn't be bothered, but their ability to do it well, to change or scale the exercise while still pursuing the same stimulus is very limited, if it's there at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, I mean, in the Real Fit environment, I personally internally have also been through those ebbs and flows where I'm in a class environment, I'm sacrificing my form and my technique to keep up with people that I don't have any negative energy towards, but I do admire them. And I guess that's kind of why I've sort of been seen to kind of come in and out of those classes and be MIA at times. And
I mean, it's a way to, gauge your progress in a sense.
yeah,
It's harder to lie to yourself, I guess, in some, or it's harder to bullshit yourself about how far you've come when you're competing against someone who is trying to beat you. It's not, a coach could potentially, give you a false sense of, they might give you an accurate sense of how you've progressed relative to where you were. But, people get to a certain point where they go, yeah, that's nice, but I want to know how far I've come relative to people that I admire as well, and see what that gap looks like now.
yeah. So that can be a process in itself.
Yeah. I mean, it can be really gratifying and it can be fucking brutal.
Absolutely,
well,
it can,
especially if you're not as close as you might have hoped that you were.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so you've wrapped up with Joe, and then you're on to your third coach, current coach at Real Fit, a beer. Similar environment, but a different personality again from me, from Joe, from all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that was a transition. An interesting transition on my part. One that we all have a bit of a giggle about now. I was very, very resistant to that change. I just lost my dad. I was already adjusting to quite a bit, and to say goodbye to, well, not goodbye, it was never goodbye. It felt like it at the time. Yeah. To part ways with Joe, and that regular contact with Joe not broke me, but like I was totally understanding of his process and circumstances, and I was so proud of the circumstances as well. Fully supportive, but he was like my big brother by that stage, and everything that I'd learnt from him, I was just super grateful for, and I didn't really want to sort of transition and
give that up,
fly from the nest. So yeah, like the guys at Real Fit, Ben and Al spoke to me for a matter of weeks, trying to get me to engage with a beer.
Oh, trying to sort of push you gently in that direction.
And I think they knew that once we would have a conversation, that all would be sweet, and it totally was. But yeah, I put up a fight. And my apologies for that. But I think at the same time it gave a little bit of a runway to form a bit of a stronger bond at the same time. We'd sort of seen each other training around the gym. My understanding is that she'd sort of thought, oh, she's been here for a while, but we'd never made eye contact. Like as soon as she'd look at me, I'd look away, and all this sort of stuff. And it was purely because I admired the grind that she put into her training. It was incredible.
A hard worker.
Oh, unreal. And that's all I'd seen. So again, I got into my own self-talk, and it hindered me from a particular process, and I was adjusting to a lot. But once I made that jump, I basically was like, where have you been all my life? So yes, now training with a beer, I think that's headed towards the 18-month mark now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been fantastic. I think, and not to get into the stereotypical world again, but having a female coach has been a really good thing for me.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding that side of hormonal play into your training blocks and particular cycles, etc., has been really cool to learn with her.
Yeah, I guess, as guys, you might be able to learn about it in an abstract sense, but it's always going to be an abstract, like it's something that you can only understand in theory.
Absolutely.
And I guess as a consequence, the intuition, without being able to recognize something without having to have a conversation it's probably just never going to be there for us.
That's right. Yeah. And like, you know, it's not an environment where you can't talk about those realities, but when you have a coach that can live and breathe that same reality as you, it certainly helps. So, I mean, you can just talk about it in a real sense and there's no bullshit in the mix or no, you know, guesswork, etc.
And you don't have to explain the birds and the bees.
That's right. So that's been really cool. She's also, so Abir started with Real Fit, I think in July of last year, 2019. And because of the kind of person she is, she's brought over quite a strong clientele of quality people.
Mm-hmm.
And so
from where she was working before? From
her previous role, yes. And that's just been really cool to sort of connect in with those girls. So we have a women's lifting group that we sort of get together on a Tuesday and a Thursday or across the week, depending on your circumstances. And so I guess working with Abir, I went back to basics once again. I never neglected what I learnt with Jo, but it was cool to strip back again with these girls and go through the process.
So you weren't
again
like apprehensive about going, you're like, you know, I've been back to basics. Why am I going back to basics again? Like it didn't feel like you weren't getting credit for the progress you made?
No.
That's interesting because it's certainly like I've certainly had that, you know, when working with physios, not really with coaches because I generally don't get trained by other people. Yeah. Oh, you're much more humble than I am in that sense.
I think, you know, once you break it down for me, this is something that I want to do for the rest of my good years. Mm-hmm. So just showing up, being in the environment, meeting like-minded people, watching them progress is just as fulfilling as my own process for me. And I think if you can't strip back to basics with anything that you're undertaking in life more times than once or twice and relearn and continue to educate yourself, you're not living.
Yeah. I remember a while ago listening to Lex Friedman's podcast and he had Jim Keller on there. Jim Keller is a really accomplished, I guess you'd call him a computer engineer, and built a lot of the, you know, framework for what people do on computers now, not just the software, but the hardware side of it as well. And he was saying, yeah, really every few years, do you want to rebuild the whole thing from scratch all over again? You're like, what? Why don't you just like improve the thing you've already got? He goes, no. Things have changed so much over that period of time that if you try and rebuild it from the ground up again, you're going to see opportunities that you didn't before because of the lessons you've learned from the last time you did a rebuild. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's certainly those lessons learned, and that's an approach that I've always tried to.
Yeah, I guess like the difference between, you know, doing a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth draft versus going, well, I'm not going to edit the one I've got. I'm actually going to write it again from scratch and see what I come up with this time that I didn't before.
Yeah. And, you know, it takes a particular personality to do that.
And a certain amount of humility.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I guess confidence in the person who's taking you through that process.
Life experience, I guess, as well, if you sort of break it down into that world. If you can endure that sort of stuff, then you can, you know, that's part of you building confidence in knowing what you're doing, learning what you're doing, feeling what you're doing, and the differences in between.
I guess it's, you know, it's also an opportunity potentially to sort of take things easy and give yourself a break for a little while rather than you're like, oh, I get to go back and, you know, just focus on the more psychological aspect of, you know, you're focusing on the technical stuff rather than like, what joints are sore?
That's
My
right.
arms are sore. I want to have
Yeah,
a rest.
absolutely.
I mean, not so much as you're younger, but yeah, now, like I'm at the tail end of a training cycle down to like doubles, and the day after, like my elbows hurt, my knees hurt, I'm sore, and it's not like muscle pain; it's like it's in the joint now.
Yeah.
It's like old man pain.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
can relate to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, do you still have issues with pain and injury now?
Not significantly, no. No, I can safely say that
And
I feel like that
Yeah.
particular injury that I came to see you about is something that have been able to put behind me.
Okay.
And that would be solely due to the particular training that I've undertaken.
Yeah.
And the fact that I've remained consistent at it for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so it'd be 4 years at this point. It'd be more than 4 years.
I'd say we're
Because
going
it
on
was
to
start of 2016 that we were working together, and it's nearly the end of 2020 now. So
yeah. So we're headed like 5-year mark.
yeah,
Yeah.
yep.
Which is pretty
But
cool
it
to
hasn't
look back
taken
on.
you 5 years to get to that point.
No.
There's certainly wins earlier on, and yes, it sounds like you were doing pretty well before you got to the end of your time with Joe.
I was probably at the peak of, my whole life in terms of physical ability when I was training with Joe, definitely. At one stage, we were training twice a week together, and then I would do program days. And, yeah, like my progress in terms of lifts and movement patterns were top shelf. I'm not shy in saying that I have regressed again. Well, probably not a regression, I suppose you could say, but I'm just not working in the same way that I was with Joe. And don't get me wrong, that comes back to bite me in the bum sometimes mentally. Sometimes I'm like, why can't I fucking lift this at the moment? Like, and it could just be a solid 70 kilos.
Yeah.
And my form just goes out the door. Like,
And sometimes it's just, you get acclimatized to really heavy load.
yeah.
And when you step away from it for a while, you have to reacclimatize again. And it's not just the proprioceptive side of it where you get used to just feeling that load on you and trying to crush you, but there's a neurological aspect of it, like learning to work with that load as well. And it's not that it, disappears, but there is a period of time where you have to, familiarize yourself with it.
Yeah,
again.
certainly. Yeah.
And it can feel like a step backwards.
Yeah.
I mean, it is arguably, but it's not a step back to zero.
No, that's right. And that's kind of what you've got to remind yourself of. Yeah, like you can't, I guess that's where ego comes into play sometimes, where like you have a healthy amount of ego to drive that lift, but sometimes it's not recharged to full capacity before you go for the lift, I guess you could say. So there have been many times where I've beat myself up and eaten myself inside out, both in the gym and outside of the gym, post-session, for not being the person that I was at that point in time with Joe. But I think, I also have to be kind to myself, and other people we should be too, in terms of like, recalibrating where you're at in life. So I went through, I did not stop training when my dad passed away, and I stopped caring for him. I used that as, a coping mechanism, I suppose you could say.
And I guess of some sense of normality that continues outside of that as well.
Yes. By that stage, I fully trusted in the people that surrounded me in the gym, and I felt safe. I felt safe enough to go in there in a vulnerable state and do what I needed to do, and I felt respected at the same time. So I never stopped training. I showed up. But, yeah, I guess mentally driving particular lifts or movements, I wasn't believing in myself that I could do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So now I'm sort of working with higher reps, lower weights comparing to what I was doing back then, and I'm training in a more compact program, so less days, I suppose you could say. It's a different style, but I'm enjoying it. I found at one stage there I was just driving myself into the ground, energy expenditure-wise as well. You know, sleep's so important. I never realised that back then. I would go from looking after Dad to the gym, then back to looking after Dad. I also had a full-time job. And then you're just running on adrenaline.
Yeah, that's just brutal.
24/7 because you're just so fucking stressed out about what's going on.
And it catches it, like you get to a point where it catches up with you.
Absolutely. So I've probably spent a good 12 months trying to sort of work that out as well and get on top of that state. And, I spent 5 years in that state, so it's not something that sort of just clicks overnight.
No, it's
your
like
body.
something else you got to recover from as well.
That's right. And so I think in my time training with Abir, I've become a lot more aware of like the CNS side of training and that burnout. And not that, you're not. And again, it comes into that perceptive side of training and worrying about other people's opinions. But what I was doing may not have seemed like a huge load in comparison to other people or the conditioning, etc. Who cares? But for me, it was knocking me. Like I was just vague and just super tired and wiped out all the time. So another side of it that I've had to learn is how to really tap into the nutrition and what works for me in terms of those training blocks as well.
Yeah, I think in my own process to, being able to get back into the gym, that's something I've had to, I guess, try and set my ego aside from it as much as possible and not, judge my, judge myself based on what is or isn't in my training program, how many days a week it is, how much volume's in there. Sort of like, the goal isn't just to flog yourself today. It's to be able to come back, 2, 3, 4 times in the same week and continue to train and be able to do that week after week, month after month. And you've got to play that long game. And I think that's probably one of the sort of hidden gifts of long-term injury is that you sort of, you're forced to learn that skill because you're not going to get out of the long-term injury until you do learn that skill. Yeah. And it's sort of, it's probably the most painful way to pick it up. But, once you've got it and you can learn to play that long game, it gives you something that a lot of other people probably don't have yet.
100%.
Hopefully.
You get very, very good at recalibrating in that process, I feel, and reminding yourself of what's important in that present moment.
Yeah.
Which can grind away at you, but it's a good skill to finesse.
Yeah. I don't really have any other questions for you. I think we've certainly covered your experience in a pretty decent amount of detail. Is there anything you want to talk about before we wrap up?
Yeah, I had a couple of questions for you.
Let's do it.
Awesome. So, I guess I wanted to sort of pick your brains in terms of your personal pain and injury experience. And as a coach, what was your biggest learning curve from a strength training perspective? And how did you handle that both physically and mentally?
So there's sort of two sides to that. One is how do I view it as a coach and how do I view it as a person who's, had to deal with long-term pain and injury. For long-term pain and for my personal side of it, the biggest learning curve was setting my ego aside. A big problem was I wanted to keep training, and I knew that certain things were going to flare up my back, but I didn't want to be seen. I wanted to be seen doing training that other people thought, oh, that's cool, I wish I could do that. Or, training where I didn't feel ashamed that other people were watching it. And what I've sort of since learnt is what was really difficult for me was not to do something that was, physically difficult and stressful and demanding. What was actually difficult was to do exactly what I needed to do and get no credit for it. And not know that people were like, oh, that's impressive. Where the only person who knew how, difficult my training session actually was me. That was probably the most important lesson, and probably arguably the lesson I took the longest to learn as a person who was injured. As a coach, I'm not sure what the biggest learning curve would be. I think whatever they are, I haven't actually finished that learning curve yet.
Yeah.
And part of it is the interpersonal side of coaching. I don't think that's something I'm ever actually going to learn as far as developing that, I guess the perspicacity for the interpersonal stuff. So that speed and accuracy of analysis when working with a person and sort of picking up the social cues that they're giving me. But I've tried to get around those problems by just being very honest with people and realizing that, I'm not going to be the right coach for everyone. And if we can figure that out as early as possible, the better for both of us. Otherwise, we're just going to waste each other's time. The other side of it is the willingness to go to school and actually, live up to the potential that other people have seen in me. And I don't necessarily agree with them, but I respect their opinion enough to sort of go, well, whether I see it or not, I trust that, they see it. And that's something I still haven't figured out yet, because I really fucking hate school.
Yeah.
I don't do well in that environment. I'm very disagreeable and untrusting of teachers generally. I'll find one thing where I just go, you're shit at this, what else are you shit at that I haven't seen? And once I've seen that, it's sort of, I write them off. So I haven't figured out that learning curve yet, but I know that it's there. As far as how I handle them physically and mentally, I think physically it's not an issue for me. I think mentally is the issue.
Yeah.
And, for the removing my ego side of it, it got to the point where I just kept hurting myself worse and worse and worse. And either, if I wanted, it got to the point where I just couldn't train at all. And I couldn't be a coach anymore because of it. So, eventually it just beat me down enough to the point where I was so fed up with being in pain and not being able to train that the ego wasn't something I cared about anymore. I hated being in that position more than I cared about, what my ego wanted me to do. So it wasn't like I had to overpower it. It just got to the point where I hated one thing more than another, and then I didn't have to worry about it anymore. I still struggle with it occasionally, but I'm very aware of when I'm doing it. And there's that voice constantly in my head going, yeah, you probably shouldn't do this, especially when it comes to stuff like Olympic lifting, where I'm like, maybe I'll just clean this bar up to put it back on the rack. I'm like, shouldn't do that, not there yet. But yeah, that's sort of where it is, I guess.
Can definitely relate to that. And during your time as a coach in that mix, what was the most common myth surrounding injury, rehabilitation, prevention, strength training?
The biggest myth is that there's an easy answer to any of it. Whenever, someone says, how would you, if someone, says, oh, I've got low back pain, what should I do about that? I go, it depends. I don't know enough to give you an answer. And anyone who, it's people are looking for those answers because they want help. Ideally, they want it to be as quick and pain-free as possible, and there's no shortage of people willing to exploit that desire. But, I guess from my own experience of being failed again and again and again by, people who are supposed to be rehabilitating me, is that the likelihood that, there's going to be a single solution that works for everyone that has the same, diagnosis of something, it might exist, but the likelihood of it is so low that you really shouldn't bother. You can have an idea of what's likely to work for, to solve a problem with injury or rehab or strength training. But then you've got to contextualize that ideal with the individual. What else are they dealing with injury-wise? How much time do they have to train? Do they have any social pressures that might actually, get them to engage in activities that they shouldn't be doing? It seems simple. Those sort of, like, a common one for injury prevention is being strong will prevent injuries. You're like, it can, but what injuries?
Yeah.
How strong? Strong where?
And true.
Yeah. So it's sort of,
it's that breakdown.
The closest you could get is being strong can mitigate the risk of injuries, but you got to get more information. Like, what injuries are you trying to prevent? What sort of strength training are you going to do? And that's none of those answers. The solution might be simple, it might be quick, and it might be pain-free, or low pain at least. But to get to the point where you can find that simple answer, it's a complex process that has to deal with the individual. So while I guess, the short answer would be there might be simple solutions, but figuring out what solution is right is not simple. It's not going to be quick. And unfortunately, I think very few people are willing to engage in that process.
Yeah. No, I've definitely witnessed that, I suppose, in the time during my own journey. And I think I would probably say, from a client's perspective, would it be right for me to say that another big challenge is to keep your client in their own lane at their own pace without that, interference of their, for me, as an example, having that fear of missing out come into play and hinder the process. Yeah,
it's, I guess it's sort of, a bit of a balancing act. You don't want to give them, you don't want to make them so fearful that they're, by telling them what you think the risk is, you don't want to make them so fearful that they're unwilling to do anything. But at the same time, they need to know how real the risk is. So you're trying to strike a balance between, giving them enough understanding of the potential consequences that they hopefully make good decisions when you're not there to look after them. But yeah, you don't want to be so upfront with, the myriad possibilities of how everything could go wrong that they start to become, anxious. And if they're already in pain, that's probably going to increase their sensitivity to whatever pain they've got. They're going to start to see and perceive issues that might not actually be there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I hear what you're saying.
It's a balancing act.
Tricky one.
And I couldn't explain to someone else how to do it. I haven't figured that out yet.
Yeah,
I sort of just, go with it. And I guess do it by intuition and instinct, but I couldn't explain it to someone else if they wanted to do it. And I'm not sure that, I'm would always be effective at doing it either. But yeah, I think it's one of those things that unfortunately you've got to learn by doing it. And
absolutely.
in that process, you're going to get it wrong.
Yeah.
And you need to, ideally, you get it wrong in a way that's not going to be too detrimental to other people, but you got to get it wrong to know where those, boundaries are.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you. I think we're pretty good.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
Cheers. Thanks for listening, and thanks to Chelsey for sharing her story. If you want to get in touch with me, I'm on Twitter @critical_coach, on Facebook @thecriticalcoach, all one word, and on Instagram as _critical_coach. Again, if you want to support me, you can do so by getting some gear from thecriticalcoach.com or simply share some of my content on your social media platform of choice. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow it on Spotify, subscribe on YouTube, or give it 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. Cheers.